Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce someone not Lithuanian for once as a workshop host. This is Kristofers, a coach for the Latvian WSDC team, a teammate of Urta Radavichuta, and he is going to tell us about conflict today. Uh, here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Definitely not a Lithuanian yet, but who knows in the future. Hi, Urte. Hope you're doing well. So why I'm here today, I'm gonna tell you a little bit more about conflict or like war in its most uh, like outrageous form. And I'm not gonna, so the disclaimer here is that I'm not a person of war studies or a person who knows an awful lot of spec knowledge in this topic. I'm just a person who sees certain trends in motions, certain trends in argumentation and clashes. So I'm going to try to go over that a little bit. So if we can go to the content slide, um, we're gonna have a small roadmap here. So firstly, I'm just gonna tell you about some trends and show you some statistics about war, about conflict in the world, also about armaments. And I think it's gonna give you a pretty good idea of like where the world is going in some instances. The second and the largest section is going to be mainly about the issues of war and conflict in debates and what are the most like common arguments and clashes and reasoning that people use to argue for any given motion. Thirdly, I'm going to just go over briefly like two motions to analyze them in terms of clashes and like apply some of the things that we're going to talk about. And lastly, if you'll have any questions, I'll gladly take those and stick around after the presentation as well. But obviously, don't hesitate to reach out if you need to at any instance. So cool. Let's just dive straight into it. So yeah, firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about trends, and if we go to the first trend that we see, is probably to talk about like military expenditure overall. And here's an interesting statistic, right? If you look at the like share of the global GDP, then you quickly see that countries spend a lot less on like arming themselves on defense in general. You could argue that maybe some of that spending is like more efficient now, or because we've entered into certain alliances between states, you kind of get economies of scale almost, right? Where not every single state in the world has to arm themselves or think about their security, because there are a lot of things that do it for them sometimes, right? If you think about NATO, then probably that's an example of where countries have been able to get away with spending very little on their militaries. And so this is a broader trend. Obviously, in the recent context, you can see an uptick in that. For example, a nation that was historically low on military spending is now increasing for the first time, rearming since World War II, which is like Germany, right? In response to certain pressures within NATO and also Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So that's definitely well an exception maybe to the broader trend in the scale of time. If you go to the second trend, you're going to see the biggest spenders on the military, and obviously, surprise, surprise, it's the United States. So that's in billions of US dollars. So they spend over 800 billion US dollars on defense yearly. That goes into like very different things, like obviously like technology. I think they have the biggest like research and development budget on technology specifically. So that's why a lot of military technology stems from the United States. We're going to talk about China in the next slide a bit more, but then you also see like Russia, you see India, you see Saudi Arabia, that is whose military support is closely linked to the United States in the Middle East. There's also countries like United Kingdom, Germany, etc. It's just that like obviously the percentage of GDP actually, like in absolute terms, like Germany, for example, spends quite a lot, but in terms of GDP, it's actually quite like negligible. They spend like less than Latvia, I think, the past few years. So that's a key difference to understand. And obviously, you see like an uptick in Ukrainian spending. I'm not sure if this takes into account like the aid that has been given to Ukraine, um, but because that probably accounts for the military spending of other states, but here you just see the main players in the global stage. Um, yeah, if we go next, I think that there's the slide about um, China catching up. And this is one of the trends that maybe people talk about in debates, that why China is a growing threat. You usually have the argument about, well, the United States has the biggest military, so we don't care. China can't really do anything about it. By some estimates, you see the gap, like not necessarily like closing, but like China's trying to catch up, and therefore investing a lot into the military. But also the other thing is that there are certain parts of the military that China is particularly good at, and if you look at the second graph here, right, it's the total battle force ships that China has invested in, and they have actually overtaken the United States, and they are like set to do so by quite a margin in the future. And why that's so? Well, because of the geopolitics of the South China Sea, right, and China taking control of certain territories that are that they couldn't do without the Navy. And here's the bit that the United States is spread out, and they're kind of going around with their navy all around the world. However, China has very specific geopolitical goals in the South China Sea, in the 9-dash line, right? So we see a trend of China like outspending the US actually in some areas. There's probably also a noteworthy thing on Chinese military spending, or like their chokehold on certain military industries. Turns out like the germanium, which is like the one of the elements like that goes into producing a lot of military technology. Well, China controls like 90% of that in the world. So it's quite interesting to just think about how much of a influence China is going to have on like the military technology even or expenditure of other states, when they possess certain critical parts of technology. So yeah, China is still lagging far behind the United States in absolute terms. In some instances, they do outspend them. So that's a worrying trend. If you go to the next slide, uh, beyond talking about just like states and expenditure, I think there's something to notice about conflicts. So if you look at the deaths and state-based conflicts by region, you're quickly going to notice that like the deaths usually like they are in relative like decline, right? Um, Obviously, you see a massive increase in 2022, but not even in Europe, right? But also in Africa due to the civil wars that are happening there. And so you do see a decline, but it's still not something that has been persistent, right? And we have the second biggest conflict, or the biggest conflict, right, on European soil after World War II. So that's like not to say that there's some sort of inevitable trend that states that people are going to die less in wars. Actually, also, if we go to the next slide, you're going to see a particular kind of conflict that people die in, which is a more important trend, I'd say. You see a less of an interstate, you see fewer of interstate conflicts, but you see more of intrastate conflicts, meaning you see more civil wars or more turmoil happening within states. And that's the worrying trend, I guess, because the share of the civil wars of all the conflicts happening has like increased, right, over time. So you have more instability in regions, you have more instability within countries, and that's the worrying trend because not always you can like intervene as an international actor. It's very hard to reach some of those places when you think about it. For example, and a recent example is Ethiopia, right, where even when you have states meddling in those, it's just hard to control. So that's an interesting thing to think about and to look at as well. Maybe there people run arguments about, yeah, that like preventing interstate conflict has been very successful in that way because of globalization, right? Because of economic trade and other factors that maybe prevent wars from happening between states, and that's a good thing. But we still have to think a lot about how to solve intrastate, like civil wars and those sorts of conflicts. If we go on then to the next slide, we're going to see we're going to jump straight into sort of the issues. Why I don't call them clashes and debates, because not always those are clashes. Those are just strands of analysis we can talk about. But primarily, I'm going to talk about issues and debates. And note that yes, war motions and conflict motions are not necessarily the most common motion type. Like you're going to rarely get a motion that's specifically about wars or weapons, or even like about interventions in other countries that might require the military. But more so, you're going to get motions that tangentially still talk about what it means for a conflict to escalate, or what it means for different actors internationally to escalate their relations between each other that might result in some physical, like armed conflict, right? So if you go into the first issue of that, obviously there's this kind of a speculation, usually debates about why states go to war, why like people choose to go to war and how they choose to justify it. And I here think that there are two like large strands of analysis that actually form a clash in rounds. The one of which usually states that people are very rather cynical and they go into conflict because of reasons of of the ones that are listed here. The first one usually people say is like, oh, countries go to wars because of resources. They are interested in like resource grabs. There are economic reasons why they do so. And the second, like larger strand of analysis is here that like it's because of domestic political incentives. And there are a lot of things that you can talk about if you have certain like also spec knowledge maybe on some states, right? It's quite useful to know what's going on there internally, not only analyze, like why leaders might invade another country. So here you can talk about maybe there being elite infighting, right? Of like the leader of the country who gets to choose the foreign policy. They get to sort of like uh, clear the ranks, maybe, or like mobilize society in a way that allows them to like purge some elites from their inner circle in fear of being overthrown, right? The other reason may be, to suppress certain minority populations. Like as we know, Russia has been using ethnic minorities in their war against Ukraine. Um, the third one, the quite obvious one, might be also just like personal ratings, right? Because we have a lot of this support around the leader, or like a very clear us versus them narrative in times of war that is very often exploited um, by certain leaders. And here, maybe the personal ratings thing, I guess, is interesting because, well, we're going to talk about it a bit later, but usually, it's not given that the personal ratings will necessarily rise. And we're going to talk about later what are the reasons why sometimes you get this effect of like more support towards the leader, and why sometimes it might not be the case when you choose to use weapons. Um, a fourth one is quite interesting. It's about economic cycles and about like the economic necessity for you to do so beyond this pure resource grab. Sometimes, well, this is a very complex thing that like sometimes is not used in debate, more so maybe in academia, is to say that, well, war is a form of economic activity upon the state. So if you want to increase a lot, like certain production, or if you essentially want to have a lot of spending by the state, well, war is one of the ways to do it. And especially if you have like a lot of lobbying of the military industrial complex in the political circles, it might be a very like uh, cynical or practical thing to do, not necessarily ideological. And lastly, like there's a bit of a security lobby in general that we can talk about certain hawks in military policies that might incentivize to do this, or otherwise threaten certain like overthrow of the political or the civilian part of the regime. So the second like flip side of that clash is to talk about ideology and talk about why like necessarily conflicts don't stem from just practical things, because the argument here is that conflicts are usually irrational, right? Usually you can get something through negotiation because you're not certain of the benefits if you go into war. Uh, War is highly uncertain. It depends on you evaluating your enemy, evaluating your opponent, right? And a lot of the times, countries go into war and then realize that they've underestimated the costs, or they've underestimated the intelligence given to them of the strength of the other side's army, right? I mean, United States being probably a good example of their intervention in war in Afghanistan. I guess they thought it would be an easy operation to execute. They stayed there for like more than 10 years, and then had to pull out because they realized they weren't making the progress that they desired. So the ideological reasons that reach tipping points sometimes of why states might go to war is one, it's imperialism, right? I think it's maybe like the part of Russia, which is maybe combined with like you can always say that it's combined with some sort of like resource grab factors. If you go after like your ex-colonies or something, you might still be interested in resources, but there might also be the ideological component that the voters demand from you as a leader, or you just are, crazy and you just want to, I don't know, leave your name in the history or something, right? You can talk about the personalities of the leaders there as well. The second one is probably nationalism, right? If you threaten your nationality or like your identity, and if you have clearly defined in groups and out groups, then you might also engage in conflict, also within a state, right? If we talk about civil wars, and lastly, obviously, like you have more so you see this in Africa, right, where you have like clear religious or ethnic differences because of like badly drawn borders. So here you can argue, whether or not that's ideological, like a practical thing, but it's still nevertheless a reason to go to war. Often, especially after like some Western leaders draw the borders essentially arbitrarily. Yeah. So those are some of the reasons you can cite. Usually, for some debates, one side uses one of the reasons more than the others, especially if it's like a narratives or like you know a belief debate. Then it might more be targeted towards ideology versus cynical factors are usually the ones used to mitigate certain ideological factors around. So if we go to the next issue, it's also something sort of like very interesting in response to a lot of the trends in how wars are fought recently. And it's primarily the accountability of the military, or like how you trace the decision-making process as well within the military and within like armed operations. So you can get a lot of like this shows up just in motions wherever you have, I don't know, narratives about the military where people want to demand certain accountability from the military, or about like literally how conflict is waged. We're gonna look at the motion about like weapons systems. So you're gonna have this clash as well. So the interesting trend here is that, for example, the U.S. use of private military contractors has led to a share of 3-1 or even more of private versus their own like state army personnel. For example, in Iraq, which was a huge change in warfare. Because those are not those are military contractors, right? They're not state soldiers. Something that we usually conceptualize as being true when states go to war. Everyone has heard of Wagner now because of Russia, but you had like Blackwater in the United States as well, operating to a massive extent in the Middle East and waging the war on U.S. behalf, essentially. And here is a very funny example, maybe when we talk about like not funny example, but just like very curious and ironic when we talk about private military contractors, is that often states use these things to just muddy the waters or sort of push the accountability away from the state and therefore like alienating voters kind of from having the ability to clearly pinpoint someone who might be responsible for like human rights abuses or just like war crimes, right? And here there was an example in Syria where Russia got called out on Wagner for the first time, essentially, because the U.S. Marines were there and they asked. So they were about to conduct a military operation on some Assad's. I think it was like an oil extraction site or something, and they essentially asked Russia like whether or not they had any like citizens or like soldiers on the soil there at that point. And during that battle, when the U.S. like bombed the site and it resulted into death of like 200 soldiers or so, it turned out that it was Wagner soldiers, and Russia was simply too afraid to admit that they were Russian, right? But later on, it turned out that literally this was one of the rare instances where the United States essentially killed. Well, the U.S. military went in and killed like Russian soldiers, and nobody really did anything about it. And it's also like a way for Russia to shed some of its responsibility to respond in instances where, for example, Wagner soldiers might be killed by the US. Because if this happened with like Russian soldiers, then Russia would essentially be in war with the United States. But by using private military contractors, it's sometimes like unclear, right? Like who really is calling the shots, or like who really is involved in the conflict. Obviously, because of the media attention that we've now had, you get like a more careful, view on these things, and you can probably trace back a lot of these private military organizations to, actual states or politicians. But what do you have to talk about when you think about this? So, firstly, obviously, it's hard to regulate because a lot of the payments that go through these private hands might be harder to trace. Um, you can also talk about just the difficulty of prosecuting them legally. So if you get like motions on, I don't know, the International Criminal Court, because it prosecutes individuals, might be able to do this, right? But for example, the ICJ, which is International Court of Justice under the UN, well, they don't necessarily have the ability to prosecute like private actors when they are in war. Uh, and as a legal entity, well, it faces a problem, right? Essentially, the United States as well, like in the case of terrorism and the like 9/11 attacks, well, it wasn't legal for them to invade. Like Afghanistan, right? But they nevertheless did, even though it's not it's a private actor essentially, right? That attacked, and it was like a first instance where people realize that it's not only states that get to conduct violence, but it's also highly organized groups. And private military is kind of similar in that sense, and it's just it's kind of murky, right? So you often get this difficulty of going after the individuals that commit war crimes. The United States as well, like the war crimes that the U.S. committed in Iraq, the vast majority of them like, if you've read about Abu Ghraib, just a trigger warning, like if you Google that or like try to read about it, it's quite triggering, um, and very graphic. But there were war crimes that the U.S. committed towards the Iraqis, and it turned out that most of those soldiers that were there were actually private military contractors, and that's one of the reasons why there's less of a supervision on the actions of those individuals. Um, and then, obviously, when you think about these private military groups, you can also think about the division of power within the state politically, right? And Russia, obviously, is the prime example where Prigozhin had a mutiny this summer, right? And you could think about how that takes away some power of the people who are like politicians, right? Who technically get the control of the military, but when it's a private actor, it's they can more easily turn against them. And then obviously one of the arguments here is that private military actors are just more effective in conducting military operations. So you get from the view of a state, it's maybe like cheaper and more effective to use a private military group, which is better trained, maybe has better expertise, or has like already had more combat experience in different conflicts, versus like paying their own army, right? So you might end up like having fewer people die or something like that. The Russian example is probably like a bit different, right? Because Wagner also like hired a lot of just people out of the jail, which doesn't necessarily mean that they're like the most effective units, but still they were considered as the stronger units on the front line. Um, and then the second part of the slide here is about the decision making process in general, not only about private military contractors, because it talks about how commands are given within the military, and these kinds of motions you actually get quite a lot of, like, who should be punished for some decisions. Is it the supervisors or like generals, right, or majors, versus like privates and like sergeants on the battlefield, like who should primarily bear responsibility? So the trend here is that it's towards a more decentralized decision making system, and especially because we haven't seen a war of such scale between two nations in Europe in a while. I think a lot of the military insights that NATO is getting and like other states are getting are quite worthwhile. Obviously, like the conflict is terrible, right? But people are learning from it to like evolve their militaries as well. So a lot of like even NATO countries are learning from Ukrainians conducting war very well against Russia, because what they're doing is they're allowing like local commanders and literally the commanders of like individual units to make decisions on like when to engage the enemy more than maybe like older armies who usually rely on the general drawing an arrow on the map and telling them where to go. So they're more responsive sometimes because of like enhanced communication and literally like running war on Discord and like coordinating much more effectively. It means that these local units are much better at making decisions. So we can talk about maybe what effects that has on accountability. Perhaps like some units might choose like the wrong thing to do or are harder to control if they engage in problematic behavior or like when they target civilians maybe in some other conflicts. So that's also a trend to talk about. The second part is that they're also more innovative. So a lot of the like if you've seen things on social media, like the Ukrainian military, because they've adapted this kind of decentralized approach a lot of the time, they also get to innovate a lot. So there are units that use like drones or like conduct their own like technological advances in like I don't know, dropping uh, homemade like grenades on like tanks, right, or like rockets, and like they innovate in a way that makes things cheaper and therefore like more affordable for the state. So that's also an interesting just observation. Um, yeah, and then lastly, something that I just put here that it's a bit of a different context, but it's an example of secrecy. So a lot of the times, like obviously states don't share their decision making process or like how they make certain calculations about war or where to spend money on. And one of the interesting like examples that was just anecdotal and I heard from a professor of mine is that in France you can literally have like a spending package on something on the military, but you don't know necessarily what it is. It's just I don't know nuclear technology, and then like turns out it's like spending on nuclear submarines, but nobody knows how many, because that would like compromise like certain intelligence to your possible opponents, right? They might find out like what exactly you're doing. And that's like a democratic problem there, right? Because you still need to be kind of secretive, and you still need to know like what kind of technology, like you want to keep the information about what kind of technology you're developing from your opponents, but at the same time, like there's kind of a vested interest in like citizens just knowing what type of technology, what type of like tactics the state is going to use in instances where it's about to defend itself or like conduct a military operation abroad, right? Um, so yeah, that's an interesting thing to think about. If we go to the next slide, I wanted to talk little bit about like precision and about casualties in war. And here you can definitely like you've seen the motion probably about autonomous weapons systems, like lethal autonomous weapons. So these are weapons that like there's a spectrum of them depending on like what the human interaction with those weapons is. Like drones being well, not necessarily like completely autonomous, right? But they're still assisted by humans. But you can like get more autonomous weapon systems in the future. And there you have to think about, what are firstly the ethics of it, right? So like if we conduct war, it's not necessarily also here about like the like vague principle about like, oh, you shouldn't use technology because that probably is hard to prove because you use like technology everywhere all the time. And it's not necessarily sure what the delta is in changing this in warfare specifically. But I think that you can talk about like a principle of access to this because if you get like lethal autonomous weapons on the side of the United States, and then you have the other side just using maybe Kalashnikovs, it's probably a very imbalanced and disproportional conflict that, if results in more casualties on one of the sides, is probably quite immoral, right? So here you can talk about it as an argument as well. The second one is probably like people dispute the precision of different kinds of weapons that we use. Here the example is usually like even when you use drones, like the it relies on intelligence that literally is very very faulty sometimes for the same reasons that like being on the ground might be faulty or not faulty. So there's not really a delta there either sometimes. So you can argue that like based on the examples of like UN like U.S. Bombing like Pakistani like tribe elders like meetings, while thinking that those are like Taliban activists. Um, since the US has failed in these instances, then it doesn't really uh, give you much like peace of mind if um, if you consider that this technology might be like used more, and it's still going to probably rely on some intelligence that you need to collect. And if that intelligence is faulty, then you just get a lot more lethal in the way you conduct warfare. And obviously, you can talk about accountability mechanisms here as well, because like there's a lot of just burden pushing in that sense. Like, who is to blame there? Is it the person who designed the algorithm of this weapon, right? Or is the person that gave it the command to this weapon for this weapon to be deployed that should be held accountable for like actions in the war, right? And then like a tangentially related issue to like weapon systems is the like certain arguments about escalation, and these sometimes do happen in motions where people argue that like, oh, if you do this, or like, oh, if you cut ties with China, they're going to escalate in conflict in South China Sea or whatever. And sometimes it's very hard to show the actual change, right? Like the tipping point of what's going to happen. Here, for example, like I think a good thing to think about is like whenever you're already very adversarial, whenever you have vastly different interests or motivations, it doesn't necessarily matter like what kinds of weapons or like what kinds of sort of like weapons are going to be given to you to conduct warfare or possibly engage in conflict, or even like whether or not it's going to work for deterrence. If you consider, for example, like Western arguments about like not giving weapons to Ukraine because oh it might escalate the conflict, it's not really like we're not really sure whether or not that's the case when you're already in an in an open war with Russia, right? So like it's mainly maybe due to other reasons about like states dragging their feet because they have to balance their budgets, etc. But sort of these escalation arguments I often find like very unconvincing if you don't put in the footwork to show like why a certain type of weapon is very very unique. And when you think about lethal autonomous weapons, it's also the same, right? Because like sometimes you could ask a question, are you okay with like the use of drones, right, in warfare? And then like where's the distinction between like when you go too far in letting like AI or like other sort of like autonomous systems decide on like when weapons are going to be deployed. um yeah, and obviously the escalation and how you control weapons is important because a lot of poorer states are just not going to be able to have those, or even if they are, then they're just going to be far less precise maybe sometimes. Moving on to the next issue, we have more so a political sort of issue here. So back from like the weapon systems thing. I think that like we already discussed the reasons to go or not to go to war, but here it's a bit of here there are arguments about whether or not the effort is going to be sustained and how it's going to be run. The first thing to note here is the body bag effect that often happens in military conflicts that you can talk about. Like, when the United States, you can see here some statistics on like public opinion, like when the casualties started increasing, like the public opinion in support of the invasion essentially went down, right? Because people, when they see the actual consequences of people dying, then they, well, are ready to compromise the initially ideologically a pure idea of like, oh, this is good for the nation to wage war now or something, right? The second part here is that the rally around the flag effects that you have like around strong leaders or the military at the beginning of conflicts tends to wane away after a while. Here you could like have a good example of like Zelensky maybe rallying people around for the cause, which is a good thing. Um, Usually tends to dissipate over time. So it's interesting to see how it evolves, because you do get like compassion exhaustion as well, just like over violence, over like the things that go on in the war, because the media cycle just like keeps giving you these like atrocious scenes of people dying, but after a while you just don't have the same emotional effect, right? An interesting thing here, though, about like political support for war and how maybe social media tends to or the media in general tends to sustain this sentiment, is the example of Putin. Like if you look at Putin's approval ratings, 14, interestingly enough, they haven't declined really that much. Even like they've had very sustained levels, even like after the invasion, and people didn't really get exhausted by the conflict, simply because I think that the unique role of social media, allowing people to live through an experience collectively, as it can now, makes it so that people get, I guess, more thoroughly engaged in that war in a different manner. And this is something that I have thought about myself as well. But essentially, people like experience war completely differently. They have a more immersive experience because they can like almost be on the battlefield because they can see, social media posts, like live or like live videos even sometimes of wars happening. So it's maybe it kind of does the opposite effect of like compassion exhaustion, because then people are so involved that it became like somehow becomes a part of their life. Here it's you can probably make arguments about why that's so, but it's an interesting clash to think about just based on the empirical observations of the compassion exhaustion not always working. The second like thing here on the slide is prioritization. So it's more so about media narratives about conflicts. Um, First one like is that the West usually overlooks a lot of conflicts in the developing world, which is true. That is not to say that we should engage in like whataboutism all the time, right? Because we should just deal with issues as they come, right? However, like there is a certain media bias in how conflicts around the world are shown, right? The ones that are more proximate to like domestic political incentives are probably going to be shown more. Also, the media cycles that gives you things about war tend to also, you could argue, even overemphasize certain features, meaning that there's a race to the bottom of who's going to show more violence or who's going to show more graphic things or who's going to show something more shocking, right? The same way like media just operates on many other issues, right? So you can argue that like this is one of the reasons why it's hard to sustain people's compassion in the long term, simply because like at some point you don't have any further to go because you've escalated the media rhetoric so far that like people don't know where what is the next message that you could give them. The thirdly here is like polarization. So obviously, just keep in mind that like whenever there's conflict, usually just because it's so difficult to verify the different details and the different factual information about warfare, like even like research institutes and like yeah, like even academic institutions have a very difficult time just piecing together what's happening on the front line, often because the intel is not shared, often because those places are just so difficult to access. Even the states that conduct the war sometimes don't know for several days or even weeks what has happened to a given unit, right? So it's kind of difficult to assess, and therefore you kind of get a lot of polarization where people start to speculate about the facts when this vacuum in a conflict exists, because there's so many moving parts that it's hard to follow. Um, yeah, let's go to the next slide and a little bit about like the peculiarities of like maybe about deterrence that's also often argued about. So we're back to like the weapons part of my presentation, and in particular probably like the like nuclear weapons. So usually people treat this as the winning argument in debates always. When like, oh, the nuclear weapons, or like when the nuclear option is invoked, like you usually get like a mutual assured destruction, and like you get deterrence mechanisms that are supposedly very, very good. Here, usually, just when you think about deterrence, usually think about it as being on a spectrum. So you don't necessarily have to have nuclear weapons that will deter the other side, because you can also have a lot of like a huge arsenal of conventional weapons. For example, the United States. Like I don't know if anyone would be ready to invade the U.S. if even if they didn't have nuclear weapons, right? Because their conventional capacity uh, is just so enormous, anyways. So it's kind of interesting to think about that as well. The second part here is that often the credibility of the threat of retaliation is actually also in academia been put under pressure. Because when you think about it, the way nuclear weapons might be launched And I've had discussions with this honestly with some of my debate friends and like some academics as well. Um, it's not always that obvious that people would retaliate in certain instances, even if a nuclear strike did happen. Why? Because A, they have some self-preservation instincts. Because like if you get like a nuclear holocaust, it means that uh, well, if the Armageddon is there, there's nothing else to defend really, right? So like the deterrence doesn't really make sense because you're not like not even like you're not destroying the enemy at the point at which you're destroyed yourself, right? So it doesn't really compute. But often people have speculated, and there have been some experiments on this, on like how politicians might make decisions, um, that they might just opt to preserve some sort of peace, even after the first strike happens from one of the nuclear powers. And an interesting here thing to mention is that usually in states there are several steps to authorize the use of like nuclear weapons. And in many instances, like people have argued, even in the example of Putin decided to launch nuclear missiles, you have some people there that might like put a stop to this because it's three people that are needed to authorize the like the codes. One of them's like Shoigu, probably, right? And the guy has actually been like before the invasion of Ukraine, for example, has been very hesitant actually about military like warfare or operations. He was one of the people who spoke against Putin like invading Crimea allegedly. So you have these like people that obviously connect to nuclear policies, but in times of like actual warfare, they might step back, right? Because people still have some self-preservation instinct, right? And not completely nuking the world. The scary thing here, though, is that this human interaction with weapons is continuously reduced because of AI in nuclear systems and in other weapon systems as well. And here, probably the scariest part is that China is at the forefront of this. They've been developing nuclear launch systems that are essentially a black box at some point. They just want to be very sure that if they are attacked, that the the second strike comes, and they've sort of like implemented a lot of AI stuff already. That's pretty problematic when you think about it, because sometimes there are near misses or close calls, and here you can use debate weighing as to saying even if this happens at the like 0.01% of instances, if something fails, then the impact is so enormous that it might lead to you opting for the safe choice. And obviously, like here, you have an example of a close call, which already happened. So, uh, just a thing to think about. And if we move to the next part of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit more about like motions. I'm just going to give you essentially like two motions of where you can use some of the things that we've talked about so far about like um, political incentives, about media incentives, but also about like spec knowledge, maybe about warfare. And so if we go on to the first, also if you have like questions or like any comments on the motions, just drop them in the chat. Because yeah, just take a moment to read this. Here you have um, by the way, a new motion type that is this house predicts. Well, I don't think it's very complex, right? You kind of get the idea of like what the burden of this motion is. It's basically proving the likelihood of something happening in the future. So you just have to use likelihood as probably the main weighing metric in all of this, which I've also written down on the slide. But this motion was the ESL final in EUDC this summer in Burgas, Bulgaria, and so it was literally set on the war. Russia's war in Ukraine. So it says this house predicts that Russia will not have control of most of the occupied and contested Ukrainian territories by the end of the war. Here, though, it's a very difficult motion in a sense because you not only have to talk about like the spec knowledge of warfare, about like some of the things that we talked about, maybe you know some of the tactics used by each of the sides, who is like what is the morale like in different parts of the military, what are the political incentives um, of leaders kind of like waging the war, or like how they're going to divert resources towards certain things. But it's also about like just trying to imagine what this possible scenario of the end of the war might be, and that it's in and of itself demands a lot of likelihood analysis into how leaders make decisions, how politicians and the military cooperate in making decisions. And here you just have this is just an example of such a broad motion. And even when you get past that, then you have to talk about, as I said, the spec knowledge of the conflict, or the spec knowledge of the military, right? So you probably have to be well read, especially in this motion when it's set in a very particular context, about which states have more powerful militaries, which states have or possess certain military technology. And here, you might get in the future some motions about China, etc. So just make sure to read a little bit more about what kinds of weapons they have, because that serves not only for deterring other states, but those weapons sometimes might be used and give them a comparative advantage in some geopolitical conflicts. I don't want to maybe spend too much time just talking, so we'll go on to the next slide because I want to just leave some time for your questions as well. Here's maybe a more general motion about not a particular conflict, but it reads, this House believes that federal governments of countries in ongoing civil conflict should offer violent insurgent groups control of land in exchange for stopping their insurgency. So this is as well linked to incentives of warfare and conflict. The first thing you could talk about is just a public perception that exists even with outside of the state and outside of the localized conflict. So that's about if you give statehood or essentially give land to certain insurgent groups, that might set a very dangerous precedent, and people might go to war even more if they see that there are benefits of doing so. An interesting example actually under this motion about why it maybe doesn't set really a precedent that's very problematic is Somalia, because they even co-opted some they co-opted some Al-Shabaab elites in certain areas of the country. So they allowed the Al-Shabaab officials to come onto the government and govern certain provinces of Somalia, which is a federal state. And in response, they ceased violence, right? And essentially, it's kind of this idea of giving something in return, even to quite horrible groups, because then those groups tend to moderate themselves more. They become less violent because they have other means to attain power, right? So it's an interesting part about maybe talking about how in terms of public perception, this might not be that good, but maybe in terms of practical benefits, you might get some concessions. The other thing that you can talk about, obviously, and here again, I think that it's the most important thing in conflict motions about likelihood, because it's not about possibilities, it's about probabilities of what's going to happen when different incentives exist. So under this motion as well, if you're an insurgent group, even if the offer is made, whether or not you're gonna actually stop the conflict, or are you gonna make this a frozen conflict that might flare up every time there's a new demand and a new concession given. So it's just an interesting motion that's set on civil wars essentially that are more actually prominent in the world currently. Yeah. I think that this is where we can go on to the Q&A section. This is where my presentation kind of stops from being very theoretical. If you guys have any questions about the motions that we just looked at, or if you have questions on other motions or other things, just feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so just a reminder, you can raise your hand to get on the stage and ask your questions with your voice, or you can type them in the chat.
Yeah, I guess we can wait a little bit. By the way, just don't worry if you don't have questions now, or if you encounter something later on, given that you're going to have a motion that's kind of conflict related, right? It's going to be set in future rounds after this lecture, then feel free to just contact me, drop a Facebook message or whatever, and we can discuss things that you might be unsure about, or things that are maybe demand more explanation in my presentation as well.
Okay, I don't see anyone typing. I don't see anyone raising their hand, so I think this is going to be it. Chris, thanks a lot for this presentation.